Hello everyone, welcome back to this video series on clinical SAS programming. So in one of the earlier videos we have seen how to convert the dates from SDTM ISO 8601 format to numeric date, time and date time values using SAS code. So in this video we will see how to convert that code into a macro, and then we'll also see how to use it or how to use the created macro to create numeric datetime values with little effort. So here we have, in that previous video we have seen how to create ASTDT, ASTTM and ASTDTM variables based on AE variable present in AE data. So let us take a look at the input data set that we will be using to create this ASTDT series variables and also AENDT series with open code first, and then we will see how to create the macro and how to uh, use the macro to create the datetime variable values. So now here we have AESTDTC and AEENDTC. So in the first step, I am trying to demonstrate is how to create them using open SAS code. So here we are checking if at least date and time is collected till minutes, and then if that is the case, we are creating ASTDT by extracting the date component and then converting it into numeric format. And then ASTTM, we are extracting the time component, which is the second component when t is the delimiter, and then converting it into numeric. And then we were converting AESTDTC using ISO 8601 IS8601 DT19 in format to create ASTDTM. And then only if date component is collected, so we are creating only ASTDT variable. So what we'll do now is just execute this piece of code and then see how our AE01 looks like. So if we see, we have ASTDT created, ASTTM created, and ASTDTM created. So which is numeric date value, numeric time value, and numeric date time value. So let's say we will have to create AENDT, AENDTM, and AENTM variables. So which is basically we'll have to copy the same piece of code but replicate it for end date. So what I'm trying to do is copy the code which I have used for start date variables and then changing the components. So I'll replace AESTDTC with AENDTC in all the places. So and the next thing is that we were creating AEN series variables here. So let me copy this AEN and then paste it in all the relevant sorry. So copy AEN, paste it in the places where AST is being used, and then here also we need AENDT, and the format statement also we need AEN. So now let us try to run this piece of code again and then see what happens. So if everything works fine, we are expecting the numeric versions for end date variable as well. So I have run this code by clicking F3 button on my keyboard. I have checked the log and there are no issues. And then I am opening my AEN series. So if we now see ASTDT, ASTTM and AESTDTM are created. Similarly, AENDT, AENTM and AENDTM are created. So the same code is being repeated, but only what was changing is the names of the input variable and the output values that are being created. So which means, so say for example, if we had a third variable like if we have to create numeric date variables in a LB domain, so we'll use exactly most of the code as similar, but we'll change the components like LBDTC and then we'll be creating ADT, ATM and DTM. So most of the code is sharing the same structure, and then uh, other content is the same. So if we can just convert it into a macro, and then we'll be able to instead of writing this entire piece of code, we'll just be able to reuse this code and then in other places as well. Now I have written that macro earlier, and then we'll see how I have converted or translated that information of the open code which we were using to get the numeric datetime values created and how to convert that into macro. So let me quickly open. So here if we now see, so we have seen the open code. So what we had was three components. One was our our input variable, and the second one is we need to specify the name of the output variable. Say for example output date variable. So when we were creating date values based on AESTDT, we called AESTDTC, we called it as ASTDT. But when we were creating AEENDTC related numeric variable, we called it as AEENDT. So that component changes. So we are specifying a parameter for what has to be the newly created date variable name. And similarly, we are creating a parameter for to pass the name of the time variable that gets created. Say for example, ASTTM or AENDTM, sorry, ASTTM or AENTM, or in the case of example where we were discussing about lab, so the time variable would be ATM. So that values would be passed here in this time var variable. So time component. So and we were also creating a datetime variable which is used to store the date and time in numeric format. So this variable is used, this macro parameter is being used to specify the name of the output variable which has to store the datetime numeric variable. So the first one is input data, and the second one is the name of the date component or the date variable, numeric date variable that has to be uh, created, and the next one is the name of the numeric time variable, and the last one is name of the numeric date time variable. So and let's clear this thing and then try to understand this piece of code. Here what we are trying to do is if DTC date not is equal to missing. So what kind of values do we pass into DTC date? So the name of the input variable which has the date in ISO 8601 format. So we may pass the values like AESTDTC to this macro parameter. So how does this work? So it checks whether we have passed any value to this macro variable name. This this piece of code gets executed only if we pass some value to the DTC date variable. Say for example, if we did not pass anything to this value, so what would happen is it will not execute anything. So we are checking at least if the name of the input variable is being passed to the macro. So that is the first check. So now we know what that first parameter is doing and what this first line of code in the macro is doing. So now I have deleted that, and then now let us see what the next line of code is doing. So here what we have said is if date var not is equal to missing. So which means what kind of values do we pass it into date var? Say if we are using AESTDTC, and if we are creating numeric date variable, we'll generally name it as ASTDT as per the ADaM standard. So it is, we are checking if at least any value is passed to this date underscore var parameter. If we are requesting a new numeric date variable to be created, so it is checking whether we have passed a value to this. So if we have passed the value, it will execute these two lines of code. Otherwise, this will not get executed. Say for example, if we have passed ASTDT value, so what happens is, and then let's say we have passed the value of AESTDTC to the date variable. So here, if DTC date has any value, yes, so we have said it is AESTDTC. So this gets resolved as AESTDTC, and if AESTDTC not is equal to missing, so as AESTDTC will never be equal to missing when we pass a value. So this code gets executed. So within that we are checking, next level check is that if we have a value passed to dateVar variable. So the dateVar macro variable has a value of ASTDT. So this is now checking if it is passed or not. One, as we are passing ASTDT, these two lines of code gets executed. So what are we doing here? So earlier we have written a length statement like if length of AESTDTC. So here technically what we are doing is we are making use of the value specified in DTC date macro variable, which is AESTDTC. So this gets translated as if length of AESTDTC greater than or is equal to 10, then dateVar is ASTDT. So the value passed to dateVar is ASTDT. So it is assuming it as ASTDT. And then here also it is AESTDTC. And then we are extracting the first 10 characters from AESTDTC and then converting it into numeric format using YYMMDD10.in format. And then we are applying the format to the newly created numeric variable, which is passed through the macro variable dateVar. So let me clean this a little. So this will become ASTDT. So this actually is becoming like the code which we have passed earlier. So we'll just see that how this was like. So if length of ASTDTC greater than or is equal to 16. So what is happening? ASTDT is being created with AESTDTC first 10 characters being extracted and then the case. So now let us see. I think I have misaligned the text, but I have deleted the entire thing. And then the next thing that we are doing here is we are checking if timeVar macro variable has a value. So for example, we may pass values like ASTTM to this timeVar macro variable. And then if we have passed any value to this, then these two lines of code executed. So what is happening here? So again, if length of DTC date, so as we were passing AEST DTC, so it checks if AEST DTC date has a macro variable value passed. So if we pass it, it enters into this line of so when we pass it, it goes here, and then uh, when we pass ASTTM to it, so it enters into these two lines of code. And then here we are checking if length of AESTDTC greater than or is equal to 16, then timeVar is ASTTM, and then from earlier we have used scan function to extract the time component, but here we are extracting the time component using substr function. So that is again, so we know that date will be present in the format of 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day and time, and then our 2359, let's say. So how many characters do we have? This is 10, so this is 11, and from 12th, so what we have, if we are passing it as starting the character as 12 and nothing as the third argument to the substr function, so it extracts the entire remaining string from that position we have specified. So if we have to extract time, so we can just specify that, so anything on or after 12 is our time, so we are making use of substr to fetch the time this way, and then converting it into time value using time8.in format, and then assigning it to the value present to the timeVar macro variable, which is ASTTM. So we'll have the ASTTM variable created. And then the next thing that we are doing is so checking whether datetime variable datetime var has a parameter or the value passed. If it is passed, so we are executing this if statement. And then again, so if datetime value has to be created into numeric format, we should have time at least collected till minutes. So if we have that value, we are converting it into numeric format using ISO 8601 DT in format using input function. So this is how our macro, whenever we pass a variable, that will be used in all the instances where DTC is present. So let me remove all of this thing and then try to demonstrate it with one more variable. Let's say if I am passing a, so let me use a different example. So let's say if I am passing LB DTC to this macro variable. So in all the places where DTC date is used, so it would be replaced with LB DTC. So similarly, say for example, for time where if I am using my ATM. So what happens in all the places where I use ampersand time where, so this place and this place and this place, the value ATM would be used when I actually call the macro. So we now have seen how the macro has been written, and then we'll see how to use this in our programming. So I'm copying the macro definition where I have the, so here I am using the same AE dataset as input and then creating a dataset named AE01. So but here instead of creating the date time values in numeric format using open code, I'll use my created macro. So when I'm trying to create the numeric variants for AESTDTC, I'll use my input data that variable as AESTDTC, and then the date variable, when if it is start date in adverse events, so the numeric date variable is AESTDT, and time var is ASTTM, and date time var is ASTDTM. So let us try to run this piece of code and then see how it works. So I have run the code, and then let's open AE01M. So if we now see, we have ASTDT, ASTTM and ASTDTM created. So what we have done is, so we have asked SAS or this macro to use the value of DTC date. We are using ASTDTC, and then for in all the instances where date underscore var is present, so like here, so we are you asking SAS to use the value of ASTDT, and then for time var we are asking ASTTM, and date time var ASTDTM. So let's say here what we have done in our open code is we have replicated that entire section of code and changed it in places. Now what we need to do is, if we have to create date time value or numeric variants for end date, so all we need is to call this macro second time with the values related to a end date. So here also we need to replace it with AEN, AEN and then AEN. So now let us try to run this piece of code. So earlier we had run it only with the macro call corresponding to start dates. Now we have added the macro call corresponding to end date. So when the first instance is being run, all the places wherein which for the macro variables, the ones which we specify here on this row will be used. When the second time we are running it, for say for example for DTC date, in all the instances where we have specified the macro variable name as DTC date, AE and DTC would be used. And then for date var, so AE and DT would be used in the second instance. So let us try to run this piece of code and then see how the output looks like. So if everything goes fine, so we'll have our AE and DT, AE and TM and AE and DTM are created. So let us do this thing. So we have created AE01 using our open source code, and then AE01M with our uh, macro code. So let us try to do a quick comparison of these two datasets and to see if everything is working fine or not. So proc compare. So I am using AE01 as the base dataset, and then in the compare I want to compare it with AE01M dataset. I'm just trying to run it. So let us try to see what the output looks like. So if we now see our AE01, we have created the numeric variants for start and end dates using open source code, and then it had 9 variables and 6 observations, and AE01M, so we have used the same input dataset as AE for this second step as well, and then it also has the same number of observations and variables. So if you take a look at the comparison summary, it says number of observations with some compared variables unequal is 0. Number of observations with all compared variables equal is 6. We have 6 observations. On all 6 observations, all the 9 variables have equal values, which means our code is working as expected. So except for, I think here I have used datetime 20 as a format, but here I have used datetime 19. So that's why it was showing the attribute difference here. So if we see in A01, when we created our datetime value with open code, I have used a format of datetime 20. So it is showing that format for ASTDTM in AE01 as datetime 20 and AE01 M as datetime 19. So this is not a cause of concern for us. Like even we can just make it as datetime 19 in the open code or in the macro based on our requirement. So basically what I wanted to demonstrate was that how the open source code, which was actually being duplicated in two different places, is being converted as a macro and then reused in other places. So here we have written our code and placed it here. What we can do is we can make this macro available across all programs within a study. So let us say if we want to create datetime variants or numeric datetime variants in our LB dataset. So what we can do is if we had made the macro available across different programs by making it an autocall macro. So if you are, maybe I'll try to make a video on what is an autocall macro sometime soon. So here I have my LB as input. So we have useObjID and LBDTC variable. So here I want to create three variables. One is ADT, second one is ATM, and the third one is ADTM to store the date, time, and date time values as numeric values. So what I need to do here is my input variable here in this case is LBDTC, and the date var is ADT, and the time var is ATM, and the date time var is ADTM. So I'll just try to run this piece of code and then see. So I have examined the log and there are no warnings or unacceptable notes or errors. So let's open LB01M and then see how the values get created. So use subjd out of LBDTC we are creating ADT, ATM and ADTM. So here if we see, so on the first two records why ADT is missing, because we have some partial dates of 2015 and 2015 December. We do not have day collected on the second record, and month and day are missing in first. So we can only create numeric date values when we know the full date. So as we do not know the full date, we have them as missing. And similarly for time also we need hours and minutes collected. So on the third record, though we have the time component present, but the minutes are absent, only hours is present. So we have time component missing on the third record. On the fourth record, we have both hours and minutes collected. So we have the time converted into numeric format. Similar is the case for ADTM. So I'll just try to show you one more variant. So for example, we are interested in creating only date. So we have both date and time components collected in LBDTC, but we only want to create date out of it, numeric date out of it. We don't need ATM or ADTM. So our macro was written in such a way that that a particular variable will get only created if we pass a value to that macro variable name. So if we do not pass a variable to a value to the time var variable, what will happen is, so this line of code will never get created. So So I'll just try to show you what I am trying to do. So here I am not passing any value to my time var. So what happens? It checks if time var is not is equal to missing. So when we do not pass any value to this, so this becomes true. So and this becomes false, and then this line of code does not get created at all. So let's try to run this code and then see the if we get any variable corresponding to the time value. So I am running this code and checking the log if there is anything wrong. Everything seems to be okay. Let's open LB02M. So here if we now see, so only ADT is created and ADTM is created, but not the variable which is related to time. So here by not passing any value to the macro variable, so we can suppress creating that variable. So let's say the initial requirement was to create only the date variable. So I'm passing a null value to my time variable and also the null value to date time variable. So if I run this piece of code now, what will happen is I'll only have my ADT created. So if I open LB02M now, I only have the ADT variable. So if I want all three of them back, I can just add based on this. So there can be cases wherein, say for example, vital signs, or if you are EG, so or questionnaires where only the date component is present. So in that case, we can just create a numeric date value with the same macro by not passing any value to the other two macro variables. And the requirement could be very rare wherein you do not need to create date but create time and date time variable. So but again our macro will still handle that. Let's say if we need to create only time and date time, or but not date. Okay, so here we are asking SAS to create ATM and ADTM, but not any variable which is used to store the date component in numeric format. So let's run this piece of code and then see if there is anything wrong in the log. So there are no unacceptable nodes or warnings or errors. So let's open LB03M. So here we have created only ATM and ADTM. So by just passing a value to that, so you can control creating that macro variable, that variable or not. So this is how your code works. Say for example, I am not passing any value to this DTC date variable. So what would happen? So our macro was written in such a way that all of these lines of code should get created or executed only if a value is passed to this DTC date macro variable. So if I run this code, nothing happens, and then it should actually create us a copy of our input data set. So nothing has happened, like no unacceptable log issues or something. So as we have not passed a value to our DTC date itself, so none of these codes or these lines of code get created or executed. So this is how you can create a macro to convert date time or date time in ISO 8601 format to numeric date time and date time values. Thank you for watching and keep learning.